Cricket has always sold itself as a gentleman's game, a sport built on trust, tradition, and an unwritten code of honor. But behind the whites, behind the applause, and behind the carefully protected reputations, there exists another side of cricket, one that fans are rarely shown. When people talk about corruption in cricket, certain names dominate the conversation. Others, however, remain protected, not because their actions were insignificant, but because their image was too valuable to damage. This is not the story of a banned player. This is not the story of a disgraced exile. This is the story of a man who was officially sanctioned and quietly forgiven. This is the story of Mark Waugh. Mark Waugh is remembered as one of Australia's most elegant batsmen, a cornerstone of a dominant era, a player whose cover drives were poetry in motion, a man associated with class, composure, and calm authority. But behind that carefully preserved legacy lies an uncomfortable truth, one that Cricket Australia itself confirmed, sanctioned, and then swiftly moved on from. In the late 1990s, Mark Waugh provided inside team information to a bookmaker. Not rumors, not allegations, not media speculation, an official board finding. And yet, most fans today barely know what happened. Why? Because this scandal didn't fit the narrative. Mark Waugh was not a fringe player. He was not expendable. He was not an outsider. He was part of Australia's golden generation, a team that dominated world cricket and became a symbol of national pride. During this era, Australian cricket wasn't just winning matches, it was exporting an image of superiority, discipline, and professionalism. That image mattered. Which is why what Mark Waugh did posed a serious problem. Because when a senior international player shares non-public team information with a bookmaker, it doesn't matter whether a match is fixed or not. The integrity of the game is compromised the moment confidential information enters the betting market. Cricket's entire ethical framework rests on one principle: players must never provide inside information to gamblers. Mark Waugh broke that rule. The bookmaker involved was operating illegally in Australia at the time. This was not a licensed betting exchange. This was not casual fan discussion. This was direct communication with a bookmaker, someone whose business depends on information asymmetry. Team selections, pitch conditions, weather insights, player availability. This kind of information can shift betting odds instantly. It gives unfair advantage. It undermines public trust. And Mark Waugh knew this. He wasn't naive. He wasn't inexperienced. He was not a teenager making a mistake. He was an established international cricketer. When the matter came to light, Cricket Australia conducted an internal investigation. This wasn't a media trial. This wasn't external pressure. It was the board itself that found Mark Waugh guilty of breaching cricket's code of conduct. The outcome? A financial fine. No suspension, no public press conference, no long-term consequences, just a quiet sanction and a quicker attempt to bury the story. Here's where the real issue begins. Compare this response to how cricket authorities have treated players from other countries, other eras, and other backgrounds. Some players were banned for life based on allegations. Some were exiled for far less concrete evidence. Some were publicly humiliated before investigations even concluded. But in Mark Waugh's case, the response was discreet, controlled, and carefully managed. Why? Because Mark Waugh wasn't just a player. He was an asset. Australian cricket in the 1990s was building a brand. Dominance on the field translated into influence off it. Broadcasters, sponsors, and administrators all benefited from maintaining the image of moral superiority. Admitting that senior Australian players were sharing information with bookmakers would crack that image. So the story was minimized. The language used was soft, the punishment was limited, the coverage faded quickly, and fans were encouraged to forget. Supporters often argue,
He didn't fix matches, he didn't throw games, he didn't deliberately lose. That's true, but that's also not the point. Cricket corruption doesn't start with fixing final scores, it starts with information leakage. That's the gateway. That's how betting syndicates operate. That's how lines are crossed, slowly, incrementally, quietly. Every major fixing scandal in cricket history began with players sharing harmless information. Every single one. Another uncomfortable truth is that Mark Waugh was not alone. Other Australian players were also found to have had contact with bookmakers during this era. Yet the culture at the time treated these interactions as mistakes rather than serious ethical breaches. This speaks less about individual morality and more about institutional failure. If players feel comfortable sharing inside information, it means the system failed to enforce clear boundaries. And when systems fail, accountability becomes selective. What makes this case even more troubling is what came afterwards. Mark Waugh continued his career. He remained celebrated. He transitioned into commentary. He became a respected voice of the game. At no point did he face lasting consequences proportional to the seriousness of the breach. The scandal didn't follow him. The questions didn't persist. The silence worked. Ask yourself this: if this had been a player from South Asia, the Caribbean, or Africa, would the outcome have been the same? Would the media have moved on so quietly? Would the punishment have been so mild? Would the legacy have remained untouched? Cricket claims to operate under universal standards, but history suggests otherwise. Some reputations are protected, some stories are softened, some truths are inconvenient. This is why Mark Waugh's case matters today. Not because it was the biggest scandal, not because it destroyed careers, but because it exposed a double standard. A reminder that cricket's moral judgments are not always equal, and that silence can be as damaging as corruption itself. Mark Waugh is still remembered for his elegance, his timing, his contribution to Australian dominance, but his story is incomplete without acknowledging this chapter, acknowledging that he crossed a line, acknowledging that he was sanctioned, acknowledging that the system chose discretion over deterrence. This is not about hatred. This is not about character assassination. This is about truth. Because cricket cannot claim integrity while selectively remembering its past. The game doesn't suffer when the truth is told. It suffers when it isn't. And until stories like this are openly discussed, without protection, without favoritism, without selective outrage, cricket's fight against corruption will always be compromised. Mark Waugh's case wasn't forgotten because it didn't matter. It was forgotten because remembering it would have been uncomfortable. And that discomfort tells us more about the system than the player himself.